Hello, everyone. This is the New Rules Podcast, and I'm your host, Dimitri Symes Jr. We've got so many things going on in the world right now, but for today's stream, we want to provide you with another Middle East update. In particular, we want to look at the situation surrounding the United States and Iran, because just a few days ago, it seemed as though the two countries were on the brink of war, but now it turns out that they're going to be holding indirect/direct talks in Oman this Saturday. To help us unpack this situation, we're very pleased to welcome veteran journalist and columnist at The Cradle, Charmaine Narwani. Charmaine, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm really happy to be here, Dimitri, and to be speaking to a different kind of audience, hopefully, about crazy developments in this region and around the world.
Yeah, so let's get it kicked off with the talks itself, because as I mentioned, there's talks in Oman this Saturday, and, the United States says that it's direct talks with Iran, whereas Iran says that it's indirect talks. What should we expect from these negotiations?
So as far as we know, they're indirect talks. There's no way, no how Iran would be announcing indirect talks if they were in fact direct. So I think in terms of what we can expect, it really depends on what the parties individually aim to obtain from the talks. On the U.S. side, for instance, are these discussions mere theater? The kind of theater you need to get out of the way, so-called diplomacy out of the way in order to go to war, to show that he's tried his best in diplomacy, didn't work, go to war. We've seen this kind of feint by the U.S. numerous times, whether it was weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, where inspectors were on the ground finding nothing, and the Americans wanted to wrap that segment up so they could go to war, because that was their ultimate aim. So is this mere theater, or does Donald Trump actually want a deal, and is hoping his man on the scene, Steve Witkoff, can deliver as he expected for him to do in the Ukraine theater? On the Iranian side, that is also a sort of multifaceted perspective. Are the Iranians there to gauge U.S. seriousness this time around? Don't forget that the Iranians, the Americans, Russians, Chinese, Europeans signed on to the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal in Vienna in 2015, and Trump basically ditched the deal when he became president. So are the Iranians trying to gauge the same things I asked? I mentioned at the beginning, whether Trump is serious, if this is just a ploy to set the scene for war. Is he going to be committed? Is his administration and subsequent ones going to be committed to staying in a deal, in a nuclear deal when it's signed? So the Iranians will be dead set on sticking to the 2015 JCPOA terms, but this time increasing and tightening U.S. commitments, because they saw how easily the Americans could walk away from a deal and scuttle the whole thing, even though Europeans and other parties had signed on. So the other thing we might see is the Iranians using an age-old tactic, the patient carpet weaver mentality, to string out these talks as long as possible to destroy Trump's momentum toward war and, to keep it off the table. So it really depends on what both parties are looking to obtain from the get-go.
So there's a lot to unpack here. But I think, as you pointed out, there is an obvious credibility problem from Trump's side. And Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei has stated publicly numerous times that he doesn't believe that the United States actually wants to get any sort of a meaningful peace deal done, nuclear deal done. And at the same time, he doesn't quite think that they're totally serious when it comes to their war threats either. So let's assume that Donald Trump is genuinely serious about getting a peace, a nuclear deal done. What does he need to do to regain Iran's trust?
Trust in international diplomacy is a very slow-moving variable. It's not something you can have overnight. So that will entail a long, drawn-out relationship that goes, that where both sides experience goodwill gestures from the other. I don't think the nature of the U.S.-Iranian relationship can experience trust for the foreseeable future. We just don't have an America right now, threatening allies and foes alike that appears particularly trustworthy. Furthermore, there are players on both sides who will aim to scuttle these talks, particularly on the American side. And of course, the Israelis, always deal spoilers or negotiation spoilers where the Iranians are concerned. I think let's just assume that Trump is gung-ho on a deal with Iran and nothing will deter him from achieving that. He's going to have to cough up a lot because, Khamenei is Iran's supreme leader, has been consistently right on U.S. trustworthiness and the fact that the U.S. is agreement incapable. He's been proven right too. But as supreme leader, he leaves the door open for the elected government to pursue its domestic and foreign policy agendas as long as they don't disrupt Iran's larger national security imperatives. And I think in this case, Donald Trump the things he'll have to cough up are, I think very clear from the Iranian side. All loopholes on the 2015 JCPOA are going to have to be closed. And all the ridiculous demands that we're hearing from the Trump administration are going to have to be relinquished. Demands such as Iran having to shutter its indigenous missile program and other things that infringe on Iran's sovereignty, and that no country, self-respecting country, would consider. The deal in this case, I imagine, from the Iranian side, must be an official treaty, not a sort of, in the way the JCPOA was. It was just a signed agreement. It didn't have any. Certainly in the United States, there was no legality holding it up. And one of Iran's requirements may be that it needs to be not just viewed as a treaty, but ratified by the U.S. Congress so that no future U.S. administration can unilaterally withdraw. The Americans are the ones that showed that they couldn't be trusted. They're the ones that are going to have to be closing the loopholes. Iran continued with the deal even when the U.S. exited. So, Iran's credibility is not on line here, but U.S. credibility is. I think the U.S., another way the U.S. could regain some trust is immediately removing sanctions, even prior to negotiations developing in full force, immediately removing sanctions on critical Iranian sectors like the medical sector, like chemotherapy drugs, diagnosis machines, et cetera, things like that. And after the deal is signed, there has to be full sanctions relief, meaning all U.S. sanctions must be removed, not just a few. When Obama removed U.S. sanctions from Iran, he went ahead and slapped on another bunch. So there can't be any more sanctions regime. Otherwise, there's no goodwill here. There's no trust building activity. And in case the U.S. reneges again for whatever reason, there has to be snapback clauses for the Iranians to renew their nuclear activities. Iran will not give up its legitimate nuclear program, which is overseen by the IAEA and follows its rules. Nuclear non-proliferation is about weapons, not about the use of nuclear energy for legitimate reasons. When I was in Iran over a decade or so ago, looking into, what Iran needs its reactor for, there's a nuclear medicine department at I think it's like Tehran University's hospital, and basically this department, does diagnostics for 1 million people a year. And you can't even, when you do an MRI, you get the radioactive stuff injected in you, the stuff that can read, the images can read what's happening in your body. Iran is producing that itself because no one will sell them any material that has, the Americans call these, dual use medicines, for instance, or chemotherapy drugs. Iran makes its own chemotherapy drugs because the sanctions don't allow other countries to sell them those, as though you can make a chemo drug into a nuclear bomb. So Iran will want to retain its legitimate nuclear program under these rules. I think there will be, as Iran did in the first round of the agreement in 2015, Iran did not allow the U.S. to bring in multiple files into the nuclear negotiations. They would only talk about the nuclear issues. They would not allow discussions about Iran's missile program, Iran's weapons sales, things like that, Iran's relationship with non-state actors in the region and support and for these actors, financial, military, and otherwise. And so Iran will not allow any discussions on anything outside of nuclear talks. And I think probably Iran would request that it be reconnected to the SWIFT payment system, which is the Belgium-based global messaging system that takes place between banks when you and I or multinationals send any kind of transaction anywhere in the world. So I think these are some trust building measures, but I can't see Trump really going that way, certainly not this early in the game, because he's gone forth with such bluster that he'll look weak and he will look like he's capitulating, and the Israelis and their friends in the media will make it look that way. They will hammer him into a corner.
There's so much that we could unpack there. I just want to zero in on your point about the treaty and the sanctions, because I think this raises the elephant in the room that everyone's ignoring. Mm-hmm. And that is the U.S. Congress. Even if we assume that Donald Trump really, really wants a fair deal and he's willing to make, reasonable concessions to Iran to get this deal done, that doesn't mean that the United States is going to get this deal done. Because in order to get a treaty passed, you need a 2/3 majority in the U.S. Senate. And the idea that Trump's going to get a 2/3 majority in the U.S. Senate, or even within his own party in the Senate, is not going to happen. Because just imagine, is Lindsey Graham going to be voting to unfreeze money that could go to the mullahs of Iran? Or do you imagine that, some people in Florida, people in the Miami district, people in, New York, so on and so forth, people that have strong Zionist constituencies, there's no way in hell that they're going to make this a treaty. And that's partially the reason why Obama, back in 2015, he decided to go basically just the sort of presidential route, because even Obama, who was much more popular than Trump at this point in the game, he didn't have enough political capital to get a treaty done. But the same goes for sanctions, because not a lot of people know this, but actually the United States Congress can prevent the President of the United States from removing sanctions that he or his predecessors imposed. Back in 2017, at the height of Russiagate, the Russiagate hysteria, Congress passed a law called the Countering American Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. And they basically said that, the president can't unilaterally remove sanctions. He needs to get congressional approval for that. And Congress historically has been very, very slow at removing sanctions. So again, it's not enough for Trump to have totally good intentions. Even if he has good intentions, even if his team is united around him, he still needs to get for the U.S. Congress, and that's going to be a nightmare.
I mean, you're right. It will be an uphill trek. I think some things could make this different. The fact that, if he could be a little bit more conciliatory towards Obama and the achievements of the Obama administration in getting at least the first nuclear deal with Iran done, and saying, look, I've just fine-tuned it to make it better. We're talking, that's not the case. I'm talking about how he can spin it. So one would imagine that Democrats would conceivably be on board for a deal. Republicans and Democrats don't vary no matter what they say on foreign policy matters much. All of the supposedly awful things that Donald Trump did in his first term were then followed up with, continued. There was continuity of those Trump achievements with a Biden administration. So there's not much difference there. Now, of course, he has a Republican majority. I think he can, arm twist them certainly to agree on what will look like his first foreign policy win, because let's be honest, he's not winning any foreign policy points anywhere in the world. But something has shifted since Obama did this deal in 2015, and that is that we were just looking at a poll at the Cradle, and I think we've shared it on our social media and written about it. U.S. poll taken in late March. It shows 50% of Republicans between the ages of 18 and 49. So not usually like the 18 to 25 or 18 to 30, 35 group, but 18 to 49-year-olds who see Israel in a negative light today. 71% of Democrats 18 to 49 see Israel in a negative light today. What's happened in the interim is the Gaza war. And what's happened in the interim is like another MAGA win, okay, in which now you have a huge portion of MAGA supporters outraged that Trump is launching a $1 trillion military budget and is already bombing countries. $1 billion spent in 2 weeks of bombing Yemen, right? This is not what he promised us. $13 billion to Israel to continue its genocide. This is not what he promised them. So I think, trying to shut down war in the region that he created, and his perception building activities created by a deal that mimics the 2015 deal, but he will spin for all he's worth, might get the support of Congress. I don't know in terms of sanctions removal. I don't know about that. That could be it's a hard task in Washington that is so where every department, office, representative, senator is so affected by the Israeli lobby and its diktats. So, but Trump is capable of doing a lot more than other more, I think, well-mannered American presidents. So yeah, I mean, it's a hard sell, but it's not inconceivable. And to be fair, I mean, the Iranians have always recognized that this is a hard sell in Congress. Maybe one compromise they can make is not having this at a treaty level, but getting other such immediate relief put in and ratified quickly at the United Nations Security Council, instead of a long waiting time, which you had with the, you have, I think in October, one of the things, decided in the 2015 Obama agreement that is now coming to fruition in the UN. So he can speed things up in other theaters, and we just don't have congressional approval. Fair enough. But Iran has zero sanctions from the beginning. UN backs this all the way. All countries are responsible for backing this because they're UN member states, et cetera. There are ways to make this deal palatable for both sides. But I'm not sure that Trump is seeking a deal. This is the thing. I mean, genuinely, all we're doing now is just, using the best of our imagination people who know the region and know the actors to guess at what could be on the table. I think what's interesting is actually having a heavyweight like Steve Witkoff sitting in Muscat, ready to come in with his Bronx real estate tycoon, negotiating style, and basically talking to a wall. This is a good tactic from the Iranians to have him sequestered in another room, unable to use his ploys, where messaging between these rooms take place in writing or in tape recorders, where nobody can suss out each other's reactions, read their body language, etc. This is a fairly, and it may be, like I said, an Iranian tactic to string out these talks as long as possible to diffuse the momentum for those calling for war.
Charmaine, thank you so much. I mean, we could keep on going and going because there are so many layers to appeal, but I think our overall conclusion is that, there is so many things that have to go right in order to make this deal work. If it happens, hallelujah. But if it doesn't, I guess that begs the natural question, what's next?
But I have to say that, when you want to go to war, you have to have your house in order. You have to have your allies standing by, okay? You have to have, your military bases sufficiently supported. You have to have your domestic front with you. Trump has literally gone to war with all these fronts, right? He doesn't have a domestic front. Even ISIS, when they needed to launch their occupation war, they had to have territory in which they were safe, which they did secure for themselves. Trump doesn't have that. He doesn't have it domestically. He doesn't have it with his traditional allies, in the EU. He doesn't have, because he's going for their jugular as well. He doesn't have it with NATO. That is appalled at him trying to, take over entire countries in Europe. He doesn't have it with the major powers, for instance, who, had he brought Russia on side and done a swift deal over Ukraine, he might have had Russia sit back. But, the Moscow sees that there's a lot of obstacles in the way of a deal on Ukraine. And so they're going to hedge their bets with the people they can trust. And as you know, on Monday, the Russians, Chinese, and Iranians officials at very high levels met in private to discuss what? To be honest, there's nothing bigger on the agenda. Iran has strategic partnerships with both of these countries, not military alliances, but Iran, Russia, and China just carried out in March their 5th annual naval exercise in the regional waterways. Okay. So they met on Monday to set a scene, to let people know that, they're all in the same war room. Why? Because China buys a huge amount of its oil from Iran, okay? Because Iran sells it as a discount because of sanctions, et cetera, right? A war against Iran would not only disrupt Iranian supply of that oil, but all supply from the Persian Gulf countries potentially, okay? It would also disrupt China's ambitious multi-trillion-dollar Belt and Road Initiative, okay, to connect Europe and Asia via road and waterway in its own way, infrastructure and development. It would also obstruct Russia's international north-south transportation corridor, where Iran, India, and Russia are the most key nodes in this trade corridor. It would, send the price of energy skyrocketing. It would, markets could crash, supply chains collapse. There are Gulf countries who don't like Iran but don't want this to happen. Just Trump's attacks on Yemen, for instance, make Abu Dhabi and Riyadh vulnerable to Yemen escalating against these countries as they have in years past. Trump is just waving that red cape in front of a bull in the worst way possible. There isn't a global actor except Netanyahu in Israel who wants war with Iran. So keep that in mind. I mean, I expect a steady stream of world leaders that Trump respects. I mean, starting with Vladimir Putin, for instance, but even Modi and others who say don't do this, even Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, even potentially Mohammed bin Zayed in the Emirates, and Erdogan in Turkey, because this is going to disrupt a lot. And we don't know how the world will recover from that. And again, he is doing this with not the support base at home, as you mentioned, Dimitri, very low in public ratings in the United States.
Charmaine, thank you for such a fascinating conversation. We'll make sure to include